So welcome to this evening's webinar on how to write effective comments. My name is Jackie Goodrum, and I'm a Conservation Policy Associate with Wild Virginia. And I'm joined by my co-host this evening, Dave Sly, who's the Director of Conservation for Wild Virginia. Dave, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Welcome, everybody. As Jackie said, I'm Conservation Director, and I'm excited about this. I have probably filed 1,000 pages of comments on various different things. So I've been through the wars and first.
Yeah. Well, we are hoping this evening, the purpose of this is to just provide some information and education and encourage you in your writing of comments. Like Dave said, we both have experience writing comments, reviewing comments, me for litigation purposes, as well as for agencies. And so given that, we wanted to share some of our experience and knowledge from that, as well as some of the research that we've done in what it looks like to write an effective comment. And we hope that you come away with just a bit more knowledge and that you're ready to apply and take advantage of those opportunities to influence environmental decision making. So I'm going to get started on the presentation, and I'm going to share my screen with everyone. All right. So here's where we're going. First, we're going to do the presentation, give you a little bit of background about the public notice and comment process, as well as define what we mean by effective comments. We'll also talk about crafting or writing your comment, as well as give you some tips and templates and just talk about a few examples of commenting. And then we'll do a Q&A. And so if you have any questions that come up during the presentation, please submit them to the Q&A and we'll address them at the end. All right, so what is public comment? So commenting is a process that allows individuals, organizations, agencies, and businesses to provide written and verbal input on proposed environmental decisions. Commenting is legally required for many federal level and state level agency actions, and NEPA is a great example of this. NEPA requires federal, state, and local agencies to put their decisions in writing every time the agency undertakes a major agency action that significantly impacts the environment. So the public comment period is the agency's response. The agency has to respond to public comments from the public comment period, and that becomes the writing and the document that the agency has to create in defending and supporting its decision. So the agency has to give the public notice. Usually this is printed, you can find it online, and sometimes still in the newspaper, depending on what level, whether it's the federal government or the state government. The agency also has to provide a meaningful opportunity to comment, and this is really important. Comments can, meaningful opportunity means that the public actually has time as well as a chance to comment, whether that's in the form of hearings or submitting comments by email or letters. In terms of time, some agencies, if like a state level agency, might give you less time, like 2 weeks, but federal agencies sometimes will give 30 to 60 days and may even have extensions. But what meaningful means is that the public actually has time and a chance to comment. And if you don't feel that you have that, that is actually something that you can criticize and call out in your comments. And so public comment is one way to influence environmental decisions, and it's one way that the government invites the public into that decision-making process. So why does public comment matter? Like, why bother spending your time commenting? First, as we mentioned, it engages and involves the public. This is one of the easiest opportunities for citizen engagement that the government provides. It also is legally important because it helps preserve legal issues for litigation. If an issue has not been commented on, then it cannot be sued on later. It also helps gather information and provides this information to the agency. the agency might not have this information because they might not actually be active on the ground where the project is taking place. And so it's really helpful for communities to provide information that the agency might not have, as well as insights that the agency might not have, depending on what the demographic makeup of the agency officials and the decision makers are. It also helps provide agency accountability. By commenting, we are making sure that the agency is looking at everything that it is supposed to look at under a particular environmental law. It also helps create the factual record. This is the sort of base of facts that you would use later on in litigation, and that everyone kind of agrees upon, and starts building things in the record that you can later argue on to talk about different project impacts. It also ideally encourages better environmental decision making, because the hope is that by providing this information, citizens providing this information, this input, their insights, as well as their opinions, that the agency will make a better informed decision. Dave, is there anything you wanted to add to why public comment matters?
Yeah, I guess, first of all, I won't promise everybody that whatever decision maker you're commenting to will always agree with you. It can be a hard time overcoming the recommendations of an agency or an applicant, but we do have some successes that we can talk about. And I think you also have to look at it in the context of when you're trying to influence a decision, your formal comments are part of the picture, but you can also take that information, that you gather, and you can make it a public presentation. You can write letters to the editor and all these other things to use the same information in a wider sense. But I was thinking of a couple really good examples where the public played, I think a pretty vital role. A lot of you know that we've been fighting pipelines like crazy here at Wild Virginia, and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which has now been canceled. There was an air quality permit for what was called the Buckingham Compressor Station, and citizens did really an amazing job there. They believed that there was a problem with environmental justice issues. So somebody who had some background in social sciences and how to assess those kinds of things got together with community members, and they just went out and did their own surveys to prove that the people who would be affected here were part of a group that had disparate treatment and were going to be victimized essentially by this process. And that is one of the issues that over which the Federal Court of Appeals invalidated that permit. And so that was a really good example where really somebody with expertise and regular citizens got together, they made comments, they gave evidence that was valuable, and they won. There's another one that I had involvement in where I worked with some other groups, and we challenged a discharge permit from a wastewater treatment plant in a tributary to the Shenandoah River. And we could not get the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality to agree with us. We presented lots of information, and we just couldn't get them to do what we thought was necessary. So we said, okay, well, I guess we'll have to sue you. Well, along the way, the people who own that facility said, maybe we can fix this. And so they proposed to make their own changes to try to address the problems we had brought up. So that kind of took us out of the formal decision making to just, we had put good information forward. They saw that it made sense to try to deal with it, and so they made changes. So I just never give up. Your words, your input matters, and you can come at it from all different aspects. And now I'll shut up.
No, thank you. That was great. So your words do matter, and public comments can make a difference. However, lots and lots of people comment, and not all of these comments are effective. What we mean by effective is a comment that is clearly and convincingly communicating your opinion about the agency's action so as to provide useful, relevant information for the agency to consider in environmental decision making. The reason that we want to try to write effective comments is because effective comments have a greater impact. They're much more likely to influence environmental decision making in the way that you would want to influence it. So they do so by providing information and insight that have the potential to influence environmental decision making. So what do we mean by effective comment? Oops, sorry about that. Effective comments are relevant. So this means that they're closely connected or appropriate to what is being done or considered. They look at the scope of whatever the agency is looking at, whether it's a project, whether it's a regulation, whether it's a permit decision, and they relate and tie back to that. And ultimately relevant means that it gets to the heart of whether or not the agency, what they're doing, if they can legally support the action that they're taking. So in writing a comment that's relevant, the comment would need to identify the question, the information that is being sought, as well as tie it back to your experience, your impact on the ground, and the agency's decision. Effective comments are comments that are written in an organized format. It has an introduction, a body text, and a conclusion. It sounds like a lot of work when I describe it that way. It feels like we're writing papers for English class, but it's really helpful for the reader if your comment is organized, and they're much more likely to read it. They're much more likely to take something away from it, because the people who are reviewing comments are looking through hundreds, if not thousands, of comments. And so the comments that are relevant, the comments that are organized, are going to be the ones that they notice and that stick with them and have a greater potential to impact the agency's decision. So again, comments that are effective have clear writing. Comments also, sorry about that. Comments also connect your experience to the question that is being asked. And this is really important, because this really, I think, can get at the heart of why you as an individual are commenting and where your voice can really have the potential to make a difference. So we'll talk more about what we mean here in a moment, but to summarize, it just articulates your reason and your authority for commenting. Effective comment also provides information and offers insights. When we talk about information, we mean facts, evidence that the agency can reasonably rely on to support its decision, and therefore would be legally defensible for the agency, because the agency is, when they're just making these decisions, they're always concerned about someone suing them for the decision that they're making. And insights, what we mean by that is we're talking about perspectives and analysis that the agency lacks, but requires in order to make a reasonable and legally defensible decision. And finally, effective comment refrains from insult. No personal insults. Personal insults against the agency, against the individual reviewing your comment. Your comment will be a lot less effective if you are insulting the person who is reading your comment or the agency that is making the decision that your comment refers to. I once was reviewing comments that we'd acquired through a FOIA for a case involving a subdivision development next to a national wildlife refuge, and just combing through the comments. One of the ones that stuck with me, not because it was effective, but because it was just full of insults, was handwritten like a ransom note, all in capital letters, like, this development is a travesty, like, you are so stupid if you think otherwise, like, do your job, deny this permit. And it sticks with me because after reading so many comments that were well written, that were clear, that got to the heart of the, like, to deny the permit because of the environmental impacts, like, agency, you need to do a more adequate environmental assessment, that one really stuck out, and not in a positive way. And so you don't want your comment to strike the reader, to strike the agency official in a negative way because it's insulting them or it's insulting the work that they do. I will, however, say that insult is distinct from critique. It is totally okay, and you want to critique the agency if the decision that they're making is ill-informed, unreasonable, and lacks the technical or legal support for that decision. Highlighting the errors that they've made, criticizing them in that way is effective, because then you are pointing out the errors that they have made. Just refrain from insults and personal attacks. So for comparison, what is ineffective comment? So comments that fail to influence environmental decision-making due to lack of clarity, lack of relevant content, and or the lack of connection to the decision being made. And again, common characteristics of ineffective comment is sort of the opposite of the characteristics of effective comment. Ineffective comments are those that miss important or relevant issues. They bury key points in dense bodies of text. They lack organization. They're difficult to follow. They don't have any format. They fail to express the ideas clearly and convincingly, either by perhaps making blanket statements without providing details or evidence. Also, as we discussed, comments that insult the decision-making maker are ineffective. So let's go back to what we mean by experience. We were saying that one of the characteristics of effective comment is connecting your experience to the agency's decision. And so we've come up with this definition that experience is knowledge plus impact. And so knowledge could either be personal familiarity with the affected environment, the project area, the proposed action, or it could be professional expertise. This is really important because from my experience, agencies do not always value personal knowledge as highly as professional knowledge, but they both are valid. They both can provide the facts and evidence that you want to support whatever opinion it is that you are articulating in your comment. So connecting your knowledge to the impact. What is the impact of the agency's decision on you, on your household, on your livelihood, on the land that you enjoy, or on your community? And so connecting those two things, sort of your background and familiarity with whatever it is that the agency is doing or talking about doing, and wherever that's happening, plus the direct impact to you. Dave, did you have any? Yeah.
Yeah, first I'll give part of the sermon that I always give, and that is that, never think that the things you care about, the things you value about your environment, the areas where you live, the areas that you use, the water, the air, your interest in those are legally protectable interest. The reason that we have a Clean Water Act and a Clean Air Act and some of the other laws is that, people are supposed to be able to use those places and be safe and be healthy. And so don't think that because you can't give them, the detailed scientific analysis that doesn't, that it's not that worthwhile. So that's part of it. And then, again, there are things that you can observe as a person who hikes or camps or who lives in an area or paddles a stream, that you essentially have expertise on because you do those things. Again, I get to tell stories. That's the fun part. Again, working on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, there's an area where folks, had been spending a lot of time, including a guy who's a friend of ours, who's a great nature photographer. And he was out there one day and took a photograph of a flower with a bee on it, and came back and looked at that photograph closely, and it said, that looks like that bee that these experts keep talking about. So he sent a copy of the photo to one of the world experts on the rusty patched bumblebee. and found out that that's exactly what he had taken a photo of. And that proved that that bee was in the area that would be affected by the pipeline. And so that changed the process. That made the agencies have to take that seriously, to go do more surveys. And it was an important find. But he wasn't a bumblebee expert. He was a guy out there taking photos, and that could be you. You know, if you see the stream and it looks horrible and it smells bad, you're kind of an expert on whether you want to get in that water or not. You know, those kinds of things you do have knowledge about. One of the things that a case that I was involved in nearly 20 years ago in Georgia brought up some interesting things. Folks wanted to dam up something like 12 miles of small tributary streams. And obviously that's going to turn beautiful little tributary streams going through the forest into a pond. Now, some people might like that, but losing the value of those streams, we thought was a bad idea biologically. But we also found out that the folks in those areas used those streams and had historically used those streams in really interesting ways. One of the prime places was a baptism area that had been used for generations. There was an area there where every spring people would go and have their picnics and watch the suckers run up the stream. Now that doesn't sound so picturesque when you're, you know, comparing it to the salmon going up the Columbia, but that was a local thing that was valued and important. So those are just some examples of how people use their own experience, their own knowledge, and their own observations to provide something that was valuable.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Ultimately, when you're writing your comment and we're encouraging you to connect your experience to the action that the agency is taking, it's about showing the agency your authority to comment, that you have expertise, whether that's personal or professional, and that your comment is worth reading and it's worth considering. And making that connection, showing them your authority, sharing your experience is going to make it more persuasive and hopefully more convincing.
Can I just add one other quick thing, and that is that, you know, some people will tell you, you know, be totally factual and, you know, straightforward, and, you know, just give them the facts. And what I would say to that is, yes, give them the facts, give them the absolute, you know, straight story, but it's not forbidden for you to put some values and some emotion in there. You shouldn't be relying on that by itself, but the fact that you do care about and value these places and that they're important to you, you're talking to human beings, you know, whether it be an agency scientist or a decision maker or essentially a judge. They're human beings. They understand values and things like that. So don't shy away from those. Don't depend on those as your only part, because that won't get it. But that combined with facts can be pretty valuable.
Yeah, and it can definitely be persuasive for a decision maker. All right, so now let's talk about crafting your comment. So before you're writing, there's some information that you need to gather. So first you'll need to find and read the public notice, depending on whether it's federal government or state government or local. There should be a website or even a newspaper notice. And we have links for the federal government notice site and the Virginia notice site at the end of the presentation. So you'll have that for your reference. In the notice, it should also give you the submission deadline. It'll tell you how many days you have, how long the comment period is open, and that's how you'll figure out when the comment is due. It'll also tell you, you also need to look up who is going to receive your comment, who do you send it to, how do you send it to them? Do you email it to them? Do you mail it to them? I feel like the majority of times nowadays, email is the accepted and preferred method of comment, as well as submitting electronically. For example, the federal government uses an entire website called regulations.gov, and you can actually submit electronically through that website for a lot of the agency actions that they undertake. And finally, and this one's a bit trickier, you'll need to identify the comment scope. So this involves reading through the comment and identifying what information the agency is seeking. Sometimes the agency will actually include in their notice saying, we are seeking information on X, or we are seeking information on Y. And that's great, because then you know some of the stuff that the information that the agency is lacking, and you might be able to provide some of that for them if that's some expertise that you have. So also, before you begin writing, you need to plan your piece. And again, this is a bit like writing papers in English class again. So you need to think critically about what you're going to say and how you organize what you will say. And as Dave has said and encouraged you, it's like your voice matters, and taking time to think about how you want to structure what you're going to say and how you want to weave in particular stories or details is important to create a comment that is organized and gets your point across. And again, remember that the person who's going to be reviewing your comment will be responsible for reviewing hundreds, possibly thousands of comments. So frame your comments in a clear, concise, and convincing manner to get your point across, and so that they hopefully remember your comment and that they find it more persuasive and convincing. So back to, what are the characteristics of effective comment? Again, it's relevant, organized format, clear writing. It connects your experience to the question asked, provides information, offers insight, refrains from insults. Your comment doesn't have to do all of these things. It should do most of them. It should definitely be relevant and organized. Your writing should be clear. You should connect your experience to the question asked. In some form, it will provide information or offer insight, and it should definitely refrain from insult. It could vary to the degree that it does any of these things, but you should aim to do all of them. One thing you might want to consider doing as you're planning and thinking about these characteristics is gathering your thoughts, writing some things down, maybe even make an outline of key points and supporting facts to include. So again, as you're crafting your comment, here's some writing tips to just help ensure that your writing is clear and to strengthen your writing. The first tip is use because statements. And this is something that I find myself doing not only in writing, but also in conversations now, especially when I'm explaining to my children why they can or cannot do something. Because statements are when you're making a statement or a declaration, the because helps link your support or your rationale for the conclusion declaration that you've made. So as an example, the agency must examine groundwater water quality impacts because our household relies on underground wells for drinking water. And so the because there helps tie those two thoughts together, both the conclusion and the thing that you want the agency to do, as well as the factual reason why and the logical reason why the agency should do that thing. Another writing tip, this one's pretty self-explanatory, is just ordered lists using numbers or even bullets, depending on how much information you have to share and whatever you're comfortable with in terms of writing. So providing sort of first, second, third, and using other transition type words. Example being the agency must deny this permit for several reasons. First, reason one. Second, reason two. Third, reason three. It can also help you organize your comment really well, because each of those reasons, first, second, third, will be a different paragraph. And it makes it really clear, organized, and easy for the reviewer to read. Another tip for writing, and this goes not just for comments, but just kind of for any writing, is show, don't tell. And this is a common writer's phrase. And so what we're talking about here is wanting you to show by providing the specifics, the details. Maybe you use imagery, word pictures, rather than just telling and making a blanket statement about something. So two contrasting examples. So first, the construction project damaged my land. that statement is telling you something, the construction project damaged the land. Okay, but you might be left wondering, how did it damage the land? What does the land look like now? What did it look like before? It's more persuasive and therefore hopefully more effective if you actually describe and show using your words what happened to the land. So you could say, the project tore up 5 acres of grass, felled numerous trees, and polluted a once clear and ecologically vibrant stream. The reader has a much clearer picture of the type of damage that occurred when you show versus telling. And finally, assert your authority. Assert your authority early. So as you're starting out, perhaps in your opening introduction paragraph, you want to tell whoever's reading, especially if they're reading hundreds and thousands and they're going to quickly be skimming yours, you want to tell them who you are, why you're commenting, and why you have the authority to comment. So as we were talking about your experience, your expertise, whether it's personal or professional, just lay that out there for them. Tell them, like, I'm submitting this comment about your proposal or your project that impacts this river that I've been paddling on for decades, things like that. So assert it early so that they get a sense of who you are, what your authority is to comment, and hopefully keep reading because they think, oh, this is someone who actually knows what they're talking about, versus the hundreds or thousands of form comments that might not necessarily connect to the project or might address things that are irrelevant. So finally, we wanted to talk about just some examples of helpful facts to include, and Dave, feel free to chime in on this too. So in environmental commenting, I recently reviewed hundreds or thousands of comments from the MVP pipeline last fall. And something I noticed was just there were several themes between the types of people who were commenting. There was a lot of landowners, community members, people who recreate in the pipeline's path, as well as a lot of people who are scientists or subject matter experts commenting. These were kind of the two main groups of people commenting against the pipeline. And I was just noticing, like, a lot of them, the comments that seemed the most impactful were the ones that sort of drew out certain types of facts that I thought, oh, that's really helpful in telling the agency who you are, what your experience is. And so here's examples of what that might look like, how you can show your experience, your authority to an agency based on sort of who you are and why you're commenting. So if you're a landowner, a community member, or someone engaged in recreation, you might want to share with them the number of years of experience with the impacted land or water, whether you own it, whether you live nearby it, you're in the community, or whether you recreated on it. You want to talk about the specific impacts that have resulted, if any have resulted, from the ongoing project or project action, whether environmental, economic, public health, as well as any specific impacts that could result from a proposed project or agency action. Also, you want to talk about why this land or water is so special to you and why it deserves to be protected from harmful environmental impacts. Dave, did you want to add anything?
Yeah,
about landowners, community members?
yeah. Again, I'll tell some stories.
Stories are helpful. They're examples. We can learn from them.
We worked on a project that the Forest Service was proposing down in the Jefferson National Forest a number of years ago. And we looked at the initial information that they gave us and the sketchy maps that they gave us. And then we just went down there and we found that although their map showed maybe 3 streams crossing a certain area, there were really more like 8 or 9. And so, it was as simple as us just showing up, taking some photographs, marking on the map where all these things were. Of course, there's many opportunities for people who actually already live there or, as I say, hike there or camp there or whatever in the specific area, just knowing facts that those agency people just may not know. Sometimes they're relying on an online GIS system for the data that they use to make decisions. Sometimes they try to make field visits, but they're limited resources. So you're a resource, and just don't ever assume that they know all those facts. Second, like Jackie's saying, you can have some real authority if you have a real connection to a place. And like, for example, we've run across folks who, my family has owned this stream or spring or well. We've used it for generations for drinking water, to water our cattle. And it has always been clear under every summer, every fall, every spring, it's been clear. And since they've been doing this construction, it's getting muddy every time it rains. I mean, that's a pretty heavy piece of fact there, and it's hard to dispute. I wanted to say one thing, and just disclosure, Jackie and I are both lawyers, and so don't hold that against us, but we talk throughout this about writing. But there's other kinds of evidence, of course, that you can and should bring in if you can, like photographs and videos and graphs and charts and things, records. You can, I've seen people have, letters, from a family member. Oh, I used to go here all the time, and this is my favorite place in the world, and here's what we did here. So think expansively about what good evidence is. Don't pass up everything and think again, we're preaching that you need to be clear and you need to be concise and you need to organize, and that's right, because that's how you'll best get attention. But don't block out, good information and good evidence in doing that.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And photographs can be particularly persuasive. Yeah, especially showing before and after type impacts. And I also wanted to reiterate what Dave was saying about limited agency resources, and that the agency might not know just because they can't afford either the money or the time to go somewhere and check out the impacts of a project. So if you are on the ground, or people on the ground, and you're seeing impacts that the agency says they're not seeing, or they haven't seen, or just you actually have on the ground information, that is valuable. And citizen science definitely provides helpful information and supplements a lot of the information that the agency gathers. So just another sort of categorical example for helpful facts to include in your comment: if you're a scientist or subject matter expert, your professional credentials and area of expertise, number of years experience in the field, any professional connections to the impacted land or waters or community, your opinion on the agency analysis, if that is something that you're qualified to do. And I'd also add, if you're a scientist or subject matter expert and you've published, including on something relevant to whatever the agency action is or the area that the action is taking place, including those publications, or the publication citations would also be helpful to include. Dave, you are a scientist too. Is there anything that you'd add?
Well, yeah. I mean, can I just go back a little bit and think about, the subject matter, what you're going to draw on to make your comments. One of the things that I like to remind people is you usually have a document or a file from the agency that's proposing something or considering something, and that's part of your raw material. I think of it like that's one side of the story. If the Virginia DEQ is proposing to issue a permit, then they're going to have their analysis as to why they think it's okay. Well, it's up to you to use that, to analyze that, and to say why it might be wrong, what they have not considered. And part of that, again, can be bringing in some expertise that you don't see represented in their report or their proposal or the applicant's proposal. We were able, again, on the Mountain Valley Pipeline, we've worked with a group of graduate students from a whole collective of universities, and they come to it with different backgrounds in chemistry and biology and ecology and hydrology and all kinds of these things. And we basically took some of the data that the agency had available to it, and we got them to do their own analyses and give us information that had not been put in the record, had not been brought out. And there again, you know, the courts saw that and said, hey, agency, you can't just ignore this stuff just because you didn't go through and do the analysis. Here it is, and you gotta count it. And then there's another class of what I call expert testimony, and I've used it in a couple of cases. But again, when especially in water is kind of my thing. We're not talking just about water here, but since that's what I know best, you know, the Clean Water Act says you have these uses that have to be maintained. So I'm supposed to be able to go and swim in streams and paddle and use them for whatever. We said that some of these streams are not usable because they're so gunked up with nasty algae that you can't use them. And part of our evidence was fishing guides and canoe rental people who said, yeah, they're horrible and I can't take my people there. People won't pay for me to take them to this place. Now, to me, that's a pretty good expert opinion. If I'm making my living off of being able to use a stream and I can't take my customers there, that's pretty forceful evidence. So again, I guess I'm just always preaching, think broadly. Don't, you know, use logic, use reason, use science, and think about it in a broad sense as to what really makes sense.
Yeah, that's really helpful. If you're a business owner who's been using this area, this water, these woods, and you're being impacted, and you are the expert on that, then that's definitely information to include.
And, you know, we had folks who had, you know, vacation cabins on a stream. And they said, you know, our favorite thing is to bring our grandkids here and swim on a nice day. And I couldn't let them get in the stream. Now that's a pretty, you know, pretty strong indictment of the environmental conditions right there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so parents, grandparents, business owners, public health officials, medical professionals, these are all like, and more examples. Think broadly when it comes to being an expert in what your experience, whether personal or professional, how it can connect to the environmental impacts of the agency's action. There's definitely room there, and that's valuable information and facts for the agency to know. There was one more thing that I wanted, that something you were saying made me think of, Dave, and that was about the documents and the agency's analysis that they're putting out. Those documents are generally pretty easy to find. They should be publicly available on the agency's website. But if you are looking to do a bit more digging, and there's more information you want to see if the agency has, you can always submit a FOIA and try to get documents from the agency and more information that way to see what exactly have they looked at, how thorough is their analysis, what are they basing their modeling assumptions on, things like that.
That gives us a chance to do our little commercial.
Yes.
Our last webinar was about how to use Freedom of Information Act, which is the FOIA, and we have a recording of it. So if you want to learn some about that, you can go find that recording. Maybe we can put that link in the follow-up email also. But yeah, you know, they're supposed to give you the information up front that they used, but there's always, there always could be more stuff that didn't get into the record or didn't get considered that you can go find. And just one other thing that occurred to me is that, sometimes we've been able, just like these graduate students, sometimes we've been able to say, hey, we don't know the answer here. We don't know whether this is going to be dangerous or not. So let's go talk to the guy at the university nearby, or let's go talk to the doctor who is a specialist in this. And a lot of times you can bring people in if you have those kinds of questions. The last thing I'd say about that is that you're critiquing a proposal. You're critiquing what the agency wants to do, what potentially a private party or a discharger wants to do, and they're supposed to justify what they're doing. It's not supposed to be the default decision that they get to create more pollution or that they get to disrupt environmental areas. The default is that they're supposed to have to prove why that's okay and why it's not too harmful. And so one of the things we do very often, I have some background in stream science, but there's many things I'm not an expert in, but I can certainly say, hey, you said this is okay, but you didn't explain it. You didn't spell it out. You didn't do what Jackie is saying. You didn't go through and piece by piece, step by step, explain why this matters, or you didn't give us the because. So if they didn't do it, then again, they've failed in their responsibility, and that's something you can call them on. So I don't necessarily have to know the answer to the hard question. But if they didn't ask the question and then answer it, then I'm going to call them out on that. And I'm going to say, you got to go figure that out.
Yeah, and that's particularly key in NEPA permits and NEPA cases, because the agency is always supposed to take a hard look. They're always supposed to consider all the impacts. So even if you don't know what the answer is, the agency at least is supposed to look into that. All right, so as you're crafting your comment, here's just some resources for you to go back to so you don't have to watch our whole webinar all over again. EPA actually has a really helpful website on NEPA and how citizens can comment and get involved in the NEPA process. The Public Comment Project is a scientist-led nonprofit organization, and they also have sort of a how to do public commenting. And finally, my favorite resource is actually the Environmental Law Institute. It's a policy, environmental law and policy research and education nonprofit, and they have a great sort of short, I think it's 2 pages, PDF on commenting that came out of a book called The Art of Comment that was written by Elizabeth Mullins, who worked at the Environmental Law Institute and was like a lawyer in DC who worked for federal agencies for decades in environmental law. And she wrote an excellent book that I actually bought and read to prepare for this. It's very short, about how to comment and comment well. And so the ELI's document just sort of summarizes key points for that. And it's a lot of information you'll have found in this webinar today. And finally, I promised the links to where to find federal notices and state notices. They are regulations.gov and townhall.virginia.gov. Those are both great places to find the notice if you've heard about an action taking place that you want to comment on, or if you're just looking for actions to comment on that might be in your area. So we have a little bit of time left for questions. I want to move on to that. I see we have a couple in the Q&A already. And let's see. All right. Okay, so the first one is, will a summary of the presentation be sent out? Yes. After the webinar concludes, actually I can send the PowerPoint itself as well as the webinar link. So that will be sent out to all attendees. And then there's a question about figuring out the deadline on the closing day. That's a great question. So Sometimes it will tell you in the notice what the time is. But generally it tends to be like 11:59 p.m. I don't think I've ever had a non-midnight deadline comment. Have you, Dave?
Yeah, I definitely have.
Oh, you have?
Um,
Okay.
they're,
They'll
yeah,
tell you.
they, they should tell you, but
Yeah,
don't
they
take
should
it for
tell you.
granted. Yeah, most of the federal ones I've ever had have been midnight or
Yeah,
11:59,
yeah.
but I definitely have had some state ones that were 5 p.m. Now, another thing you'll encounter maybe is 30 days from the date of this announcement. And so sometimes they don't spell out the date that is the deadline. You got to go back and count, because if there's 30 days versus 31, you're going to, you got to make sure you're right. I've seen people one day late because they assumed that it started on the 8th of this month and ended on the 8th of next month. And yet they had too many days. They had 31 days. So don't take those things for granted. But I'm looking at the question.
Yeah, the question answer also asked if it was worth putting together and submitting a comment after closing time on closing day. So after the comment period
Yeah.
ends. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, if you've gone to the trouble of putting them together, then absolutely dump it on them. You know, agencies, if they are really trying to find out the right answer, they often will pay attention to things that are not, I guess, officially part of the record. So yeah, I would do it. And in fact, sometimes we submit things to agencies even though they don't have an active public comment period going at all. In fact, some of the things we've had with the Corps of Engineers and the Fish and Wildlife Service, they didn't say, hey, we're going to take your comments, but we give them to them anyway. And sometimes we're able to make an impact with those. So yeah, I'd say why not? I mean, I wouldn't start at 5:01 putting your comments together and then send them. But if you're that far along, why not?
Another question related to the time is calculating comment days, counting days to comment. Is it calendar days or business days?
Mhm.
A lot of times the agency will say the specific date in the notice, but if they don't, it's generally business days is how they'll tell you sometimes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you just have to be careful. You have
Yeah.
to pay close attention and not take
Yeah.
things for granted, I
So
think.
I guess the answer is it depends.
Yeah. Remember, there's a lot of lawyers involved on that side
It
too.
depends. Yeah. So there's another question about how effective are non-expert or uninvolved comments. I get lots of emails asking me to send comments, but I'm not personally effective. Is it worth my time to research and send a general comment? I think non-expert comments are still can be very valuable, because if you feel compelled to comment, then you likely have some kind of valuable information or insight to contribute. Uninvolved comments, I don't really know. I think if you're not personally affected and you don't feel compelled to comment, then you don't necessarily need to. If you're talking about doing like I think in that case, an original comment would be more effective than a form comment. And form comments are when, and we do this too, when nonprofits or businesses pre-write a comment, and it's the same comment, and they send it out to, or ask people to sign on to it, and then the agency receives like hundreds or thousands of the same kind of comment. And those comments, and the form comment could be written very effectively and very persuasively, but it's not a popularity contest, in terms of the agency's not going to make a decision based on, oh, for the permit got more comments sent in support of it than voting against the permit. So yes, you have a comment.
That's
So
absolutely true.
that's my opinion.
Yeah. Well, and it's
But
not.
I think it can be more valuable from a public relations or assessing sort of public interest or public appetite for the particular project. That's where I think it's actually more useful, the quantity of comments.
Well, here's an example, or here's an experience. Sometimes I've seen an agency that wants to do something, that has proposed something, and if there's a huge number, even if they're form comments that are in favor of what they want to do, they'll really highlight that. Now, you're right, they can't technically make the decision based on that, but it can have an impact. And so, it is worthwhile to be part of a huge crowd, as part of, the kind of the public relations part of the whole thing. Now, a lot of agencies will say, if you're just signing on to a form comment, or if you're signing a petition, then we don't count all those individual ones as something, something separate. And that makes sense. So sometimes we just say, write a couple of sentences on your own, and that at least makes it stand out as something personal.
Yeah, and I realized when I was talking about format earlier, I was saying body, like you want to have like introduction, a body, conclusion. But honestly, you could write a perfectly effective comment in one paragraph.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a couple more minutes if anyone has any more questions.
What is this touched on? Learning as much as possible about my audience before I pin anything. I want to know who they are and what makes them tick. Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, it does matter who the decision maker is. Sometimes it's an agency, if you want to call them a bureaucrat, somebody who is a career agency person. And sometimes, like in Virginia, we have what's called citizen boards, State Water Control Board, the State Air Pollution Control Board. Those are folks who aren't necessarily technical experts. And so it's worth thinking about what, how much of a straight technical person this is versus, a regular citizen who is going to think in a broader sense. It's not always easy to find out or to know what's going to get their attention. And that's why I say, give them the facts, give them the straight story, but also if there's values and emotion and things, incorporate it. Don't let that take over, but incorporate those things, because again, no matter who they are, a real human angle should matter to them. And if it doesn't, then you're not going to win them anyway.
Yeah, and always tie everything back to the decision that they're making. Always make it relevant.
Oh, here's one. Tips for speaking in person in front of municipal governments, commissions, or boards. I mean, I go back to the kind of, ideas of being concise and organized and so on. It's even more important in a oral testimony or comment to be, very targeted and very clear than it is in writing. But I think all the other things that Jackie explained are just as important there. Show why you have some authority and some knowledge. That,
So we do have a couple, it is 8 o'clock. We do have a couple more questions. So in the chat there, since the decision has been taken away from the citizen boards, should we bother? We were just talking about
Yeah.
citizen board thing. Why don't you share about that?
Well, first of all, yes, you should. They apparently, although the legislation is not through yet, apparently there are going to be some provisions where the board still gets to look at some of the major permitting situations. They just don't have the final word, but they will still have the authority on making new or amendments to regulations themselves versus specific permitting decisions. And that's really a big deal. So they're going to be important, and it's going to be important for us to keep working with them and trying to influence them.
All right, final question. Do the FERC commissioners actually read the comments posted about the MVP pipeline? What do you think, Dave?
Well, you got to remember FERC commissioners, the 5 of them, they're kind of like judges. They play what's called a quasi-judicial role. So they have law clerks, they have the staff of the FERC, and no, I'm sure every commissioner doesn't read every comment, but they go at it as if here's an official legal record and we've got to pay attention to it. So I think they take it seriously because here again, they have to act as judges. They know that if they don't acknowledge information, important information and facts and legal arguments, that they can get overturned. And nobody likes to have that happen to them. So I think it's worthwhile. They come at it with their own slants, just like any other decision maker. But I think they pay attention.
Yeah, I think always in the back of their mind, the thought of their decision being overturned is there.
Yeah. And the part of that is whether you should put the name of the commissioners themselves or Kimberly Bowes, who is I guess the clerk, or I forget her title. But yeah, I would just use her name. It's funny that you can't really technically talk directly to those commissioners during these things because they do play kind of a judicial role. So it all gets filtered through, but again, it gets to them, and to the extent it's good stuff. I think they feel compelled to pay attention to it.
Yeah, and yeah, I agree. The recipient's name should be whoever's listed in the notice, even if you know the commissioners will be the ones making the ultimate decision. So, all right, well, it is after 8. Thank you everyone for coming and joining us this evening. We'll be sending out an email with the recording, the reference links, as well as the PowerPoint. So thank you so much. And we hope this was helpful and that you feel more prepared and encouraged to take advantage of opportunities to submit public comments.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.